Welcome. I'm Brian Lowry from the Stanford GSB, and this is Leadership Society, Reimagining Work Post-COVID. And today we're talking about globalism. As the world continues to grapple with the COVID pandemic, despite the advent of powerful vaccines, we continue to grapple with issues such as supply chain disruptions, rising food prices and energy prices, as well as continued recovery from unemployment and housing problems associated with the pandemic. We also have seen that the pandemic has been uneven. The effects of the pandemic have been uneven, and so too have the recovery. So too has the recovery. So what we see today is about 75% of the vaccines have gone to upper income and upper middle income countries, and only 1% to lower income countries. And so today, what I'd like to talk about is how do we think about our interconnected economy in the context of the pandemic? And to help us think about that, I'm pleased to have Secretary Rice joining us today. Secretary Rice was the 66th Secretary of State of the United States. And Secretary Rice is currently the Denning Professor in Global Business and the Economy at Stanford University and the Tad and Diane Taub Director of the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. So let me just jump right in. My first question is, what has the COVID pandemic demonstrated about the global economy?
Well, it's a very interesting question because I think if you think back to the last two big international crises that we had, both of them actually strengthened international cooperation. So let's go back to September 11th. I was National Security Advisor on that day. After 9/11, the international community of states, various states, really thought about the terrorism problem as their problem too. And so we got unparalleled levels of cooperation on intelligence sharing, on law enforcement. If you and I go into an airport these days, whether it's in Dubai or Miami or Paris, it's pretty much going to look the same because we came to some agreements about how we would make it safe to fly. We were able to trace terrorist financing across borders, and we were even able to get something called the Proliferation Security Initiative, which meant that 90 countries agreed to stop suspicious cargo on the basis of intelligence from another country. Well, that's unparalleled cooperation. If you think about the crisis of 2008, the financial crisis, I remember when President Bush invited the G20 to Washington in November, and there were a set of principles that they adopted, that they wouldn't engage in beggar thy neighbor trading policies. His first call was actually to the Chinese president because of the Chinese investment in the US. You didn't want to see some playing around with that. The Chinese said, absolutely not. We will play this straight. And so again, tremendous cooperation. If you fast forward to the COVID crisis, this has been the revenge of the sovereign state. My PPE, my citizens, my travel restrictions, my border restrictions, and now my vaccines. And so one has to wonder kind of what broke down here to change the way that states responded. Because when you think about this, Brian, this is clearly a borderless crisis. This is clearly a crisis in which we all have an interest, but you're not getting the same international response. And I actually think that if you are going to rebuild that sense that the international system has to cooperate at times like this, it's going to have to be very intentional. You're going to have to find ways to do it. Globalization was already weakening. And the COVID crisis, instead of strengthening the sense of global cooperation, actually weakened it.
Mm-hmm. And what role do you think global inequality plays in that? So we know that's been, as you mentioned, the kind of sovereign concerns, certainly around the vaccines and PPE, et cetera. What's the role that global inequality plays in the phenomenon you're describing?
Well, if you think about the fact that every country has tried to manage this for themselves, essentially, then the countries that are capable are going to be able to do it. Let's take India, for instance. This was a country that in the initial stages of the pandemic seemed to be doing relatively well. And then there was the huge outbreak a few months ago. But even though it continues to be a problem, India, because it has resources and it has institutions that work, it's been able to kind of put it back in a box, if you will, and to get things better. If you take countries that don't have that capacity and they're trying to do it on their own, What we really did need was some way to strengthen their capacity to do this. I would harken back to or compare this with the way that we dealt with the AIDS crisis. In the 1990s, it looked like AIDS was ravaging a whole continent. The continent of Africa had neither the resources nor the institutions to deal with it. And so when President Bush launched the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS relief, and when we launched the Global Fund, we launched not just financial assistance to Africa, but also assistance to build up their health infrastructure. So inequality really is, not to put too fine a point of it, kind of a death sentence when you are in a situation that countries decide to tend to their own first. We really do, now that we're getting through, I hope, the worst of the crisis, maybe we can go back and take a look at what we have to do for some of the poorest countries in the world to be able to recover from COVID.
And given what you just said, I think I might know your answer to this, but during the height of the pandemic, there were concerns about depending on other countries for necessary, for example, medical equipment, PPE as a good example. Are there things that you think that we should necessarily support domestically that we should not depend on other countries for? Should we subsidize industries that manage, for example, PPE or other medical necessities?
The United States is wealthy enough and capable enough that there's really no reason that we should have supply chain vulnerabilities when something like COVID comes up. We really, I remember we had a speech, George Bush gave a speech. He'd actually read about the 1918 pandemic. And so he gave a speech in his last months to the National Institutes of Health about preparing for the next pandemic. Well, we didn't, to be fair. We could have done something to stockpile equipment. I don't think everything has to be shared. That's not my point. But what should be, we need to understand what needs to be shared and what needs to be national. When it comes to issues like the equipment that you might need for a medical crisis, there's no reason that we should have supply chain problems around that. We learned some ugly truths during this pandemic about our dependence on China for a lot of our pharmaceutical production. That really doesn't make sense. But when you think about things like travel restrictions, for instance, is there a way to do that in a more coordinated way so that you don't get a patchwork of travel restrictions? To this very day, it's hard to travel internationally. You never know. And even within Europe, I mean, Europe was supposed to be one market. And even within Europe, there are such variations on how you travel, when you travel. Austria just shut down again yesterday. And so I think the question for the international community is what needs to be national, and a lot of it can be, what needs to be international in terms of actual rules of the game and et cetera, like travel restrictions, and then what needs to be provided to countries that may not be capable of providing for themselves, and what are the mechanisms for doing that. And I would break it up that way. I wouldn't try to say, well, everything has to be nationalized or everything has to be international.
Right. I'm happy you brought up travel. So I want to turn a little bit to migration. So not just leisure travel, but really when people move for economic reasons. And that's my understanding is the biggest reason that people migrate is economic concerns. How do you think this migration is going to be affected by the pandemic? And how do you think that migration is likely to affect global politics?
Well, migration happens for really one of two reasons. One is people migrate for economic reasons. The other is they migrate because of conflict of some kind or another, a crisis of some kind. And it's conceivable that if the pandemic were to continue, that you would see low enough economic response, low enough economic growth that you would start to get some of these economic migrants. I don't think we've yet seen that. It's partly because everybody's very careful right now about who they let into their country. But at some point, we might see that. I have to just take a moment to say, of course, we've seen incredible internal migration within the United States, because some of those people who went to work in Wyoming or in Arizona don't want to return to cities. And you're having more Americans changing jobs or quitting their jobs than we've ever had in our history. And that says something about internal migration in the United States. And so the first question is, what will that mean to the balance of power in the United States itself? And then when we look out globally, of course, you have to look at who recovers from the pandemic most quickly, who's able to move on. Some people will say, well, China did very, very well. They've recovered, but they also set a standard that I'm not sure they're going to be able to meet. Zero COVID is going to be nearly impossible to meet while sustaining economic growth. And so it's going to be very interesting to see if they back off this notion. And it's supposed to be about the superiority of their system. So it's now pretty hard for the Communist Party to say, okay, we're going to back off zero COVID, because ultimately, if we keep shutting places down when there's one case of COVID, we're going to end up having problems in economic growth. So I think there are a lot of questions still to be answered. Mm-hmm. It's too early to say whether there's going to be a redistribution of economic power. My guess is not, that you'll have, instead, a kind of reinforcing of the current economic balance of power, though there may be some countries that look a little bit different in this case, like the United States, which may look a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. And so you point to the kind of domestic challenges, or I don't know, challenges, there's changes and shifts that are happening as a function of internal migration in the United States. When you look around the world, you see two things politically, I would say. Right now, you see a rise in authoritarian regimes, which has gotten a lot of press. And you see migrations often from lower income countries to higher income countries. And there's a possible link there, in the sense that often, not always, but often, authoritarian regimes take advantage of xenophobia to push their agenda. So I'm wondering if you see that connection as you project out. How do you think about global migration and the rise of authoritarianism around the world?
Well, I would associate the rise of authoritarianism with the worst aspects of populism. So not every populist is an authoritarian. Some populists actually exist within and operate within a democratic framework. So I think you could say a populist like Bolsonaro in Brazil. He's a populist, but within still something of a democratic framework. When you look, though, at some of the more authoritarian regimes, you get a healthy dose also of xenophobia, because very often the appeal of a populist authoritarian is to that sort of nationalist fire. But I don't even call it nationalist. I call it nativist. It's not just our country. It's great. It's our kind of people are the people that we want here. And you are seeing that in a number of places. And there you see that there's a hardening of immigration laws. There's a hardening of charitability toward people who are having to migrate for whatever reason, even to refugees. We've seen a kind of hardening on attitudes about refugees. And so, yes, the two are linked, but I think that the authoritarian piece really comes from the lack of institutional controls or institutional framework on others. One of the things the founding fathers did really smartly in the United States was they distributed power. So you have three co-equal branches of government. That means it's really hard for any executive to become so strong that you threaten the other institutions. In places where democracy is less consolidated, you see the executives just get too strong, and they sort of overwhelm the rest of the institutions. So it depends a little bit on where you are on that level or that journey of democratic development to see what this authoritarian phenomenon looks like. And then, of course, China is the ultimate authoritarian regime. I would even say moving from authoritarianism to totalitarianism. And the difference there is authoritarians basically try to control the political space, but there's room for other things, maybe even a private economy. probably private universities, perhaps the arts are free. When you move toward totalitarian, a word that, by the way, Mussolini coined, everything becomes in the service of the state. And you're starting to see in China an authoritarian regime that can't tolerate alternative sources of power, which is why you're seeing the crackdown on entrepreneurs and private companies like the Alibabas of the world, while you're seeing the emergence of the red arts, while you're seeing people, the Chinese Communist Party telling kids how long they can game. It's when you start to see that you think you're seeing a shift in the way the authoritarianism is moving.
I'm happy you brought that up. I wonder what role the U.S. has to play in that. So right now, when you have a huge global disruption, I mean, it allows for the possibility of realignments. And we see a number of countries, authoritarian regimes, even ones that might be moving toward totalitarianism, using this disruption in all sorts of ways. What role does the U.S. have to play in trying to maintain some degree of balance in the world, or the continued existence and advance of democracy?
Well, there's only one country that can fundamentally reshape the global framework. If you think of the framework the United States sort of championed after World War II, uh, international economy that was based on free trade and free movement of capital, some hope of democratic development, U.S. security blanket over it all. There's only one country that can challenge that, and that's China. The Russians are basically a declining power that can make a lot of trouble in places, but they don't have the economic or technological capability to fundamentally reshape the international framework. China has that potential. And so the United States, I think, has to think of this as a different kind of adversary. The Soviet Union was a technological and economic midget. I remember my first time in the Soviet Union. I was a graduate student in 1979, and I walked into a store, and they were doing the calculations on an abacus. Now, I was giving this talk to a undergraduate class a couple of days ago, and I looked out there, I realized they didn't even know what I was talking about. What's an abacus? So that's how technologically lacking in sophistication the Soviet Union was. Well, China is not that. It's a technological, military, and economic giant.
Mhm.
And it's one that we invited into the international economy and integrated it into the international economy. And so now that it is trying to change the rules of the international economy, the rules of the international system, now that it is using tools like AI and quantum computing for both military gains and for social control at home, we suddenly find ourselves in a very different situation. And so the real question is, if we don't want a complete restructuring of the international order, you have to figure a way to deal with China. And I will say this, Brian, which is that sometimes we have kind of authoritarian envy. You know, authoritarians can build great airports, they can do this, they also make a lot of mistakes. So, because, you know, when you have a single point of failure, if you're going to be omnipotent, you'd better be omniscient too. And very few human beings are omniscient. So back in the 70s, the Chinese decided, beginning of the 80s, that they were going to have a one-child policy to control population. And now 34 million Chinese men don't have mates. So when authoritarians make mistakes, they're usually doozies, as opposed to democracies, which are kind of slow, and there are a lot of veto groups. And just do the thought experiment. Can you imagine the United States trying to have a one-child policy? Just wouldn't work. So there are some guardrails with democracy that don't exist for authoritarians, and they make mistakes. And the other big mistake the Chinese are making is because they've been so assertive and so aggressive under Xi Jinping, they are actually causing other countries to balance against them. That's why you get a quad, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. It's why you get something called AUKUS, Great Britain, Australia, and the United States. It's why the French and British are doing freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea, the Chinese have managed to mobilize others against them.
Hmm. I take that's a good point, but Condi, it's also true that democracy is awful messy, and
Yeah.
certainly right now in the United States, people are sometimes people pine for what looks like simplicity, even if what it produces is not the best thing.
I would, you know, what's really interesting, Brian, those are mostly people who live in democracies. People who live in authoritarian states probably wouldn't tell you the same thing. I always note that, you know, we don't appreciate that. Yes, it's messy, but even let's go back to COVID for a minute. Can you imagine the circumstances? We can't even get people to obey mask mandates. In China these days, if you come up with a positive COVID test, you're basically locked in your house with a policeman outside. You can't travel. They're going to shut down your whole city, and they're going to shut down the city from which you traveled. So when people start talking about the wonders of authoritarianism, they ought to think about what it really feels like to live in one.
No, I completely I take that as a great point. The problem is once you slide toward it, it's a little bit harder to get out than it was to
Right.
get in.
That's right.
So sticking a bit with China, so you talked about how China's role that it's playing in the global economy. What would you say about business? So we have a number of major businesses that operate in China, U.S. businesses that operate in China. There are concerns about data, in particular. So I'm focusing on like the tech companies, but those aren't the only companies. But what would you say about how these organizations, how these corporations should operate in China, or whether they should operate in China?
Wow. It really depends on what industrial vertical you're in. So let me start with the good news. If you are a consumer facing company that sells consumer products, but not with big cultural implications. So, you know, if you're doing movies in China these days, you're going to get caught up in some of the your movies have cannot criticize anything that the communist government might think is criticizing it. So that's one exception. But basically, if you're doing products for Chinese consumers, that's going to be fine. I had a conversation with Adam Silver of the NBA. You may remember that when the Houston general manager said something about Hong Kong and the Chinese threatened to shut down the NBA. And I said, Adam, they're not going to shut down the NBA because pretty soon those young princes, those only children who are very entitled in China, are not going to watch the Kazakh national team play the Chinese national team. They want to watch LeBron. You will be back. And so there is a market among young, upwardly mobile Chinese for American products. You're going to be fine. At the other end of the spectrum, if you're in the technology business, particularly where you're dealing with frontier technologies like AI or quantum computing, don't go there because there is a decoupling taking place. The Chinese, in part, want to do it on their own, and it's basically now about the race to gain intellectual property to be able to do that because they actually now have significant indigenous capability on the technical side. And if you are a US company, there is a watchful eye on investment in Chinese companies, Chinese investment in American tech companies, and even things like whether or not a Stanford ought to have Chinese students in a lab that's dealing with AI. So the technology sector is one that I would say beware. And then everything in between, it sort of varies. Ironically, the financial services businesses are very valued right now in China. The banking sector was not open in China for decades, and they more recently opened it. Why? Because their own financial services institutions are so messed up that they want kind of the disinfectant of Western practices. The problem is the one you mentioned. You're also data companies. And so you have to be careful because the Chinese are going to demand that they have access to all data, particularly on Chinese citizens.
So it raises a couple of questions about regulation for me. So one, there's already been some concern, as you noted, about Chinese students in labs that have sensitive data or sensitive technologies. Um, How do you think about maintaining the balance of, we bring in, part of what's made America great is we bring in the best talent from all around the world, and people come here and they participate in the American economy and they become citizens, and that's a huge strength. How do we maintain that while also dealing with the possibility of people coming in and trying to take that technology out for other reasons? Should we be concerned about that? Should we be regulating that?
Well, we should be concerned about it, but I'm probably on the end of the spectrum that says that if that I would rather not sacrifice the openness of our universities and the free exchange of ideas on the chance that somebody might steal a secret. So I'm probably among my national security friends. I'm probably on the liberal side of that. I had a conversation with the FBI director not too long ago, and I said, don't try to make universities into intelligence agencies. If you think somebody is working for the PLA, don't give them a visa, and we won't admit them. But once they're at Stanford or MIT or Caltech, starting then to say, well, we're going to have a national test for labs. If you're of a certain nationality, that's a slippery slope. And I also think it probably underestimates the degree to which Chinese indigenous capacity in most of these technologies is now pretty advanced. If you were going to do this, you probably needed to do it 10 years ago, not now. And so I'm more interested. There are a few areas for instance, advanced semiconductor work. We know that China wants to become independent in semiconductors. They can't do the very high end. And so that might be a place that you wall off, not from universities, but at the very high end with technology transfer. One of the problems we always have in regulating technology transfer to adversarial states is we overreach. So I remember when I used to have to administer something called COCOM, which was our way of keeping the Soviet Union from getting advanced technologies. We were trying to control things that you could go down to Radio Shack and buy. And so we really need to be careful that we're not trying to overregulate. Find the few things. I'll tell you a very good example of something we did well. Huawei, the big Chinese telecommunications giant. I would not want Huawei in my 5G network because I'm quite sure that if they're asked to do certain things, they will do it because they're a Chinese company and they're not going to buck the Chinese government. But do I really care if Huawei sells headsets in the rest of the world? And so we have to be much more parsimonious in what we actually try to control.
Yeah. And do you think we should be trying to regulate business more strictly? So the Apples and the Facebooks. I mean, what role should the U.S. government have in regulating that kind of industry?
Well, again, I'm kind of a libertarian on most of this. It's not that I'm totally anti-regulation, but I understand two things about regulation. One is regulators will regulate even if they don't understand what they're regulating. That's the first point. And the second is the regulations are very often for the last problem, not the current problem. And I think with technology companies, I don't know if people remember that when Mark Zuckerberg testified a couple of years ago before the Senate, and it was embarrassing, not for Mark Zuckerberg, but those senators looked like they'd never seen a smartphone. And so you ask yourself, is this really how you want regulation to go? I've been arguing to tech companies that they ought to think about self-regulation, and they ought to think about it in really two pots. One is, what really do we need to think about in terms of privacy and what the consumer knows about what's happening with their data? Now, to be completely honest, consumers are of two minds about this. So every Saturday morning I do my Amazon shopping. I like the fact that they remind me that I need that kind of cleanser. Am I slightly queasy that they know that much about me? Yes, but the convenience is something that I don't want to give up. And so consumers say they want privacy, but they are really of two minds about it. But privacy regulation seems to be something that is worth pursuing. I actually think what the Europeans did with the GDPR is not crazy as a starting point. It would also maybe give us a common ground with Europe, because whatever our differences with Europe, they pale in comparison with our differences with China. So I would start there. The other bucket of regulation I'm more worried about, which is this notion of breaking up companies because they are so big and so multifaceted. And I fully get it. People are angry at social media. It is disruptive in a lot of ways. It has a lot of downsides. Uh, but I don't think that Mark, he just wanted to talk to his friends at Harvard. He didn't really think he was going to be the infrastructure of the country, or that, the Russians were going to use their platform to intervene in American elections. I mean, who does that kind of thinking? And so I think on that side of it, we probably are going to have to come up with some kind of mechanism. And the companies are trying. They're trying community standards. They're trying to have these panels, like the Facebook panel, to set standards and the like. But it's very, very hard with an open portal like the internet to manage control. The one thing I hope we don't do is start willy-nilly just deciding they're too big. We're going to use old-fashioned, 19th century notions of concentration and monopolistic behavior, because that could leave scale in China instead. There are only two players in this space. It's the United States and China. Europe's not a player. India's not a player. No other place is a player. And so would I rather it be Microsoft and Apple and Facebook, or rather it be Alibaba and Tencent? So I think we aren't thinking about this and the implications of constraining our own companies in ways that might be harmful.
Well, first, let me say that I am impressed that you keep your Amazon shopping to 1 day a week. Your Amazon shopping on Saturday, good for you. But in terms of corporations, should we? I worry about trusting them to self-regulate. I'll just say it that way. And that there's a number of reasons to have concerns about that. First, on some of the things you already talked about, it's not clear yet whether they're self-regulating, even after in response to some of the uses to influence our elections,
Right.
And maybe even more, I don't know, troubling, but a bigger issue is they haven't really done a good job of self-regulating in terms of climate change.
Yes.
And so self-regulation, I just wonder, like, how much trust does that require in business? And should we, given what we've learned over the last, let's say, decade or so, should we have faith that they're able to self-regulate?
Well, I think there's a difference between self-regulation and being a part of designing the regulatory structure. And I think that the companies have to have a role, largely because I don't think government regulators understand this very well. And actually nobody does. It's a whole, this didn't exist 20 years ago. And so everybody's learning about both the upsides and the downsides of these technologies. And I would like to think that it could be more of a partnership rather than a punitive, we're going to regulate you, because the companies have an interest in some degree of regulation. I'm quite sure that these companies don't want to be on the front page of the New York Times every day about the latest bad thing that they've done for society. And so I do think there are incentives on the side of the companies to get to a regulatory regime that makes sense. It's why I bring up the GDPR when it comes to privacy in Europe. It's not identical to what we should do in the United States, but it's pretty close. And most companies that I know that operate in Europe, and most of them do, have found it not that onerous. And so maybe you take some framework like that and find an American version of it. I just think if we leave it to government structures to do it, we're going to get something that really does begin to undermine one of the great strengths that we've had, and it puts the advantage in the hand of China.
Mm-hmm. So let's go a little bit further on the climate change aspect of this in terms of where organizations are. So according to a New York Times report, the U.S., and I think this is well known, the U.S. historically has produced the most greenhouse emissions, right? So when you think of early 1800s up till today, you think that means we have a greater responsibility to respond to climate change than some of the less historic emitters, or yeah, how do we think about the government's responsibility in this?
Well, I don't really like kind of retroactive accounting. This sort of assumes that the United States understood in the 19th century what the implications might be of certain kinds of emissions, or even for that matter, in the 1970s or 1980s when it was really still an air quality issue. And so I think what we have to do is we need to go back and we need to say, how do we help countries, whatever their history, to come to a satisfactory equation for what I call the three E's: economic growth, energy mix, and environmental sustainability. So those are the three elements, and it's a little bit like a pulley system. You want to make those work together in a way that gets you to a good outcome for the for climate change and for the environment. I think we've got everybody's attention, but the problem is now, what are you going to do about it? So let's take, I liked the Paris Accord, actually. And one reason that I liked it was that it let countries develop national plans that were kind of aggregated up. When you start setting big targets out there, kind of international targets, people sign on to them, they're great signing ceremonies, and nobody actually follows them. And so better to have workable strategies in each of these countries. The one thing I would say about the developed world is less that it ought to punitively pay for what it did in the 19th century or the 20th century, that I do think that there are some ways that we could subvent on behalf of poorer developing countries, to prevent them from having to go through the same pattern of emission that we did. We've done this basically with cell phones. Nobody's building out these big telecommunications networks in quite the same way with everybody with a cell phone. So what polluting technologies could they skip? And is there a way to help them? So coal is one of the really big problems in developing societies. Is there some way to help them wean from coal, if that means technological support? I've long believed that one thing we could do is tariff-free trade in climate responsible technologies. That would probably help. And then we're also going to need some work on resiliency or mitigation if it turns out that we were wrong about the timing. So if I live in the Caribbean at this point, I would be pretty nervous about whether or not we're right about the timing of when climate change will become catastrophic. And so who's doing the planning? You mentioned earlier on, Brian, population movements. We could be looking at massive population movements around issues of climate change if we are wrong about the timing. So I think there we owe it to those countries that are most vulnerable to help them to plan for and execute ways if in fact the worst happens.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's already some evidence of that is happening in certain places, right? So when you look at, I believe the Maldives, some of those islands
Yes.
already are being inundated. So
Yes.
we probably are already past the point at which these things are going to start to happen, and we're really thinking about mitigation, I assume.
Yeah, but people don't want to actually talk about that. The problem is that the rhetoric is all about 1.5 or the following carbon net zero by fill in the blank. That's great. I don't have a problem with that. But since there is some uncertainty around the science of climate change, and since we are not sure about adaptations that the Earth may or may not be making, I think we also have to have an adaptation and resiliency approach as well, just in case we're wrong.
Yeah, and when you think about the people who are going to be displaced, should we start thinking about those people differently? So when you said maybe we should do something to mitigate, as a richer nation, we're in a position to help mitigate the consequences of climate change. What about the individuals that are that will be maybe already are being displaced? Should we treat them differently? Should they be given refugee status? How should we think about um, the people who are being affected right now by climate change?
Well, I don't think we're quite there yet because I think there are probably mitigations within countries that could be, let's take not so much migration, but food supply.
Hmm.
Food supply is probably going to be severely affected by climate change. And so, how do we think now? We have all kinds of interventions on the agricultural side that can forestall catastrophic food supply issues. We just never employ them in time. Now, one of the reasons that we have refugee crises is we don't do anything until people are on the move. One of the reasons that we have famines is not because of the absence of food, but there's maldistribution of where food ought to be.
Mm.
And so the food's in one place, the populations are in another. There's usually some warlord in between, and we can't get the food to where it needs to. So that's the kind of planning that I'm talking about. And if it means that there are some places that are already not sustainable, now we have to start to think about what we're going to do about those populations. I don't think we're there yet. But frankly, I think people who know a lot about agricultural mitigation, people who know a lot about refugee patterns, people who know a lot about demographics, because some of these populations are young, uh, those are the tools that we ought to be using. And when you say that, then a lot of climate activists will say, "Well, you don't want to deal with the problem." No, I do want to deal with the problem. I just don't know that I've got enough certainty about what problem I'm going to have at a
Mm.
particular point in time. And we know also that the transition from hydrocarbons is going to be slower than most of us would like, because the fact of the matter is nobody's learned to fly an airplane on wind. So what does that say about how we accelerate renewables? We did some work at the Hoover Institution on, thanks to George Shultz, actually the late George Shultz, on revenue neutral carbon taxes, because somebody needs to level the playing field for renewables in terms of investment. So there are so many aspects to this, and when when COP 26 spends all of its time just thinking about, how they're going to get everybody to declare net zero, I think a lot of opportunities are being missed.
And I think the idea of transitioning, so you highlighted the transitioning from hydrocarbons might take longer than people think. What's the relationship between the government and private industry here? So as you talked about a carbon tax, should the US government be more aggressive in creating a movement towards renewable energies? Like how should they interact with private industry on this issue?
Well, the government should remember that there are several sources of pressure, or the positive word would be several incentives, several sources of incentive for instance, car companies to move to electric vehicles. Whenever Europeans talk to me about, the United States isn't doing anything, I say, well, who actually built the first electric vehicle that somebody actually wants to drive? And of course, those would be things like Tesla. And so I think there are plenty of incentives right now in the system for electric vehicles. What could the government do? I do think, and just looking at the infrastructure bill that's just been passed, I do think the question of the infrastructure for electric vehicles, the gas stations grew up basically as private enterprise. Chevron did Standard Oil, which was Chevron, did the drilling, they refined it, and they sold it. That doesn't seem to work with electric vehicles. You're going to need a different kind of infrastructure. That's something that I think governments could do. And I don't know if it's charging stations. Everybody that I know, if they're building a house, they're putting in charging stations. So people are already reacting as if we are in a world of electric vehicles. But I would step back and I would say, what can I do to hasten that transition? And then when you look at companies, the big oil companies, they're all pretty active in trying to move toward renewables. But again, you have to be a little bit careful. I actually don't want, during this transition, where hydrocarbons are still needed. I don't want the only hydrocarbons to be produced in Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. When we've just gone through this period of incredibly high oil prices, and the Putins of the world getting again enough revenue to make trouble in Ukraine, the way that Hugo Chavez made trouble in Latin America. I was secretary when the price of oil went to $147 a barrel. Nothing warps diplomacy like oil at $147 a barrel. And so I would rather, this is why I disagree fundamentally with trying to shut down the North American hydrocarbon platform between Canada and Mexico, the Keystone Pipeline and the lot. I would rather keep the capacity here until that transition is complete, because I sure don't want it to be Russia and Iran that benefits.
So I'm going to ask at the end, to ask everyone the same question. I'm going to ask you a slightly altered version of that question. So this is about reimagining work post-COVID. If you were to think about work, the economy, the global economy post-COVID, how would you want to reimagine it? What would you hope comes of this?
The two most important things that I think will come of this, and I think they're happening, it's not even reimagining, is I think you have empowered workers. And people have more capacity, more power, more ability to control how they're going to live and what the relationship is going to be to work. I would just like to see that, not just for the laptop class. So I'd like to see the way that, because work has been very unequal. If you were of the laptop class, none of us have missed a beat in terms of productivity, getting our work done. If you had to go to the restaurant or to the shop room floor, it was a different experience. And that's in part a skills issue. So I would like to see the skilling work more toward giving people more freedom in their work. And oh, by the way, one of the things that's giving people greater freedom in their work is the gig economy. And when you start trying to control the gig economy, or saying, well, you're just employees, you're going to kill some of the best things about the gig economy if you're somebody who really only wants to work between 1 and 6 in the morning. So I would say the first piece of this is I'd like to see us come out with a new appreciation of how workers can have greater impact in what their work looks like. The second one is, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, I'd like to see the international system get back to thinking about what do we need to do internationally, both to recover from this crisis and to avoid the next one. On the recovery, business travel is still awful because of the patchwork of various restrictions. And, I know people don't want to talk about a vaccine passport or whatever, but there ought to be something that allows us to travel as freely as we can with clear or global entry. And so getting to that is, and it's going to take governments to do that. They've got to take that up. And that's one place that I think the United States could really lead. The other thing that I'd like to see the international system think about is, what about next time? And here, we were very fortunate that so much of the science was in place, that technologies were in place to build a platform for these vaccines. Just imagine if we were still waiting for a vaccine for the length of time that we've been waiting for a vaccine for HIV/AIDS. We still don't have one. We would be in really bad shape. So we need to keep that scientific and technological engine going. And that means that there is a danger in saying to companies, you just have to give away your IP. We did have an experience with pandemic life-saving drugs around HIV, and we came to a set of regulations, a set of principles by which the drugs could be made available at a low cost to places that needed them, but where you didn't rob these countries of the R&D funding that they need to move on to the next stage. We have some time, I believe. One of the really odd things is the degree to which, until now, Africa, or most of Africa, has been less affected by the pandemic than people would have predicted. And there are all kinds of explanations. It's a young population. Maybe that's it. South Africa is the most affected because it's really a crossroads and others are more isolated. Maybe it has to do with something that people have been through so many pandemics that they've gotten some kind of strange immunity. Who knows? But this isn't going to last. And so we're going to have to find a way, back to your first point, the very first point you made, that we recognize that vaccine distribution is not just a matter of charity and largesse. It's actually a matter of security and safety. And the next time around, I hope we'll have better strategies for doing that, and better strategies, frankly, for seeing what's coming. I was also National Security Advisor when SARS hit. Same thing happened. The Chinese didn't tell the truth. We knew something was happening. We didn't know exactly what. This time around, I believe the early warning signals actually were coming out of business. They were coming out of global companies that watched workers come back from a ski vacation in Italy, come to England to a company headquarters and infect people. And all of a sudden people thought, oh no, this thing is highly transmissible, well ahead of where the World Health Organization understood that. And so putting together our early warning systems the next time around might actually take advantage of some of that business knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate the time and your insights on what we're facing right now. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Great. And next time we're joined by Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, as we discuss reimagining work. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.